And welcome back. Now, about 600 Nigerian nationals were repatriated to Nigeria yesterday, and they opted to leave South Africa following a wave of attacks directed at foreign businesses. And hundreds of foreign nationals from several other countries remain displaced after fleeing their homes. So today we take a look at how economic, political and other challenges faced by some other African countries have actually contributed to the current events in South Africa. And with us here in our Joburg studio is Langa Malimela, who is a senior country risk analyst at IHS Markit. And from our Hatfield studio in Pretoria, we are joined by Faith Mabera as a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
Langa, I'm going to start with you. Now, just taking a look at your company's job description, you advise business and government on issues of governance, stability, political stability, economic focus, operational risk and security, and so forth. So with that in mind, what's your assessment of the situation in South Africa at the moment?
Thanks very much, Sakina. It's obviously a hugely troubling one. Given the fact that countries are working on the African continental free trade area, for example, which is something that a lot of countries and a lot of businesses abroad are looking at as something that is hugely progressive for the continent, and so which is something that creates a customs union for 1.2 billion people on the continent. And that is hugely in jeopardy when you have instant activities like this, particularly where Nigeria and South Africa are concerned. We know that there are historical tensions between the two countries. And we know that Nigeria has signed the African Continental Free Trade Area, for example, but has not necessarily ratified it because they have major concerns with issues regarding labor, etc., and some of the sort of entrenched big players in that economy concerned about the entrance of South African goods into that market. So from a business perspective, something like this is very concerning, and it does worry those who are adamant that this free trade area must be implemented and that it is a huge stepping stone for African prosperity.
But given what's happening in South Africa at the moment, Faith, and there's been a lot of emphasis at looking at the local conditions that have given rise to these attacks and flare-ups that we've seen. However, looking further, looking to our neighbors, looking to the countries where some of our brothers and sisters hail from, let's talk about what's happening out there. And people talk in some instances about failed states. Let's start there by looking at what a failed state is and whether this is a phenomenon that is perhaps happening and contributing to the people leaving their countries of origin to come to South Africa.
In this regard, to actually avoid pervading a single story. Because what we need to appreciate is that when it comes to migration, there is push and there's pull factors. So any inadequate consideration of this push and pull factors is what we need to consider. So whether you're looking, for instance, at a migration crisis across the Mediterranean, or you're looking at the South African situation in which there is inherent crisis in terms of immigrant numbers, I think you need to look at it from a specific political context. And reading within this political context is the question of deep crisis within the neoliberal economy in amidst of what we've seen, economic slowdowns, which have led to widening vertical and horizontal inequalities among states. And these are just, for instance, some of the factors that you need to weigh in, whether you're looking at the external milieu or the internal milieu of migration issues. So at the heart of it is migration issues, but also from a policy perspective, whether the immigration policy of a particular host state is able to stay attuned to the wider political context and the wider migratory context in this regard.
But do you think African leaders, Faith, are paying sufficient attention to what is actually happening across the continent? A body like the AU, for example, are they doing enough to address some of the factors that lead to these migratory patterns that we are seeing? If we think back, for example, to 2015, you had European countries giving money to Africa, $1.8 billion it was, to try and stem this tide of migration. But, you know, what are the African leaders themselves doing in order to try and normalize situations in the various sovereign states?
So as I said, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, but a wide reading of the continent points to a failure on the part of governance. So there's already huge gaps in the area of governance. There's shortfalls in the area of actually providing leadership on these questions. There's a failure in coming up with adequate policies to actually meet the needs and priorities of African citizens. So by the very nature of human needs and the quest for, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the instinct for survival and the instincts to actually find purpose and to find satisfaction will actually drive any human being to pursue, whether be it economic migrants or in the cases you're pointing out where there's failing social and political climate, to actually seek out safety. So in that regard, there's been wide failings. There's a mixed picture across the continent, but certainly good governance is in short supply.
So, Langa, you cover Southern Africa. Let's talk about what you have come across in this particular region.
Yes, I think that one of the problems historically in this part of the world is that in terms of coming up with policy, we've generally done quite well, and the African Union in particular has also done very well. It's got a Vision 2063, all with really strong, very good policies. And even if you go back, we have the African peer review mechanism and NEPAD and structures that were developed under the regime of former President Thabo Mbeki. But in terms of the efficacy of that, or following through on that, there's probably been very little
but let me interject
inability
there,
to hold each other to account.
Because we often say that about South African policies as well. How can we say that they are good policies if they are not implemented? How then do we know that these policies are actually worth the paper they're written on?
I suppose we don't until they have been implemented. But what we're seeing, for example, if you take Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, between 2015 and 2017, these countries have very important changes of leadership, right? And so you have new leaders coming in with lots of hope, lots of expectation. But the bureaucracy which holds up that leadership and the political parties that these leaders come from are still the old political parties, still the old bureaucracy. So you don't necessarily get fresh leadership, new ideas coming in. And so on one hand, there's lots of optimism, etc., whereas on the other, you're still dealing with the same sort of institutional infrastructure, and you're unable to then have more agile institutions that can ably implement these policies.
And I want to go back with Faith to this notion of, what the individual states are doing in order to try and make sure that people don't want to leave, don't have to, take to flight because they're trying to find, as you pointed out through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a way to satisfy even their basic needs. But speaking about that, again, you had other nations trying to send money so that people just keep people at home so that they don't have to deal with the issue of migrants coming and, flooding their borders. What was done with that money? Do we know? Has anybody tracked what was actually done with that $1.8 billion that was sent to Africa?
So that points right back to my question about good governance, because you can continually give money, but if there's a massive absorption capacity and a lack of accountability on the parts of governments, then it's sort of an effort that comes to naught in the larger scheme of things. So to put a finer point on it, I think it's important for, rather than looking at these issues of external management of migration in the sense of a knee-jerk reaction, I think the bigger question question we need to be asking ourselves on the continent writ large is the question of whether there's actually pragmatic policy responses to the question of migration, whether the approach to migration is not entirely based only on a risk approach, for instance, viewing migration only as a risk factor in that sense, but being attuned to how migration fits into the broader globalized economy and the globalized politics of world politics. So I think those are the more critical questions from a policy level and from a strategy level. Those are things that we need to consider.
But are we then not absolving certain nations from taking responsibility for making sure that we don't talk about things like a migration crisis, but rather that, when people do decide to move, it is managed, it is something that people do by choice, and we don't have to, go and view bodies floating in the ocean as people try to make their way to Europe? Are we not absolving some nation states from actually doing what they are supposed to do by keep on harping on the nations who are dealing with the problem of people coming into their countries?
There's that element, but I think also we need to particularly address this notion of migration grounded in facts and figures. So, for instance, like you mentioned, pertinent to the African context, it is a fact that Uganda hosts the largest population of refugees and asylum seekers on the continent, well above the 1 million mark. But yet, if you look at the UN, for instance, they've lauded Uganda in terms of having one of the more flexible refugee policies. So when you look at it in that regard, it's not a question of whether you're absolving certain countries from their responsibilities. It's a question of, we are speaking of Africa united. So the idea of Pan-Africanism, for instance, far-fetched? Is it a dream in the remote that we can't access? We have to look at it from that perspective. Number two, we're talking about regional integration. The question of whether, as a continent, for instance, are we willing to put our money where our mouth is? Are we willing to actually live up to what we claim to be solidarity in terms of the African continent? Those are the issues we need to look at, and by their very nature, a lot of these problems that stem, for instance, from migration are transnational. They spill across borders. Conflict, to a large extent, in the nature that we've seen, it has a spillover effect. So managing the spillover effect in the realm of policy and in the realm of practice is what is of essence. Looking for solutions that aim at a collaborative interaction among actors and among countries. I think that's what's important.
And if you look at how countries are managing the situation at the moment, Langa, and in response to what Faith is saying, I'm reminded of that debate in Parliament 2 days ago, where Musiwa Lekota of COPE, he actually made the point, and he said, what we cannot ignore is the fact that there are borders. Yes, we have these ideals and these plans that you also point to, Agenda 2063, but the reality right now is we have borders that need to be managed. We do need passports in order for us to move around even this continent. And as such, we need to manage whatever is happening within that context. But you also advise governments on how to deal and restructure, SOEs and all of that. What sort of advice are you giving to these governments that you deal with in order to get them to turn around the situation whereby they are able to create jobs, turn around their economies, and be able to keep their population happier?
Well, what we're seeing, I think if you look in South Africa, with regards, if you look at the paper released by Minister Tito Mboweni a couple of weeks ago, if you look at what's happening in Angola and Mozambique, and to an extent in Zimbabwe, is an intention, at least, to try and rationalize government, to make government more efficient, to make government smaller, to create spaces for businesses to come in and take up some of this work. And so that is one of the ways that, as IHS Markit, we see government being better capable of of creating economic opportunity. In other words, and so it's very contentious, obviously. And in South Africa in particular, there's been huge backlash to Prime Minister, at least Minister Mboweni's paper, because there are such massive political repercussions. And if you're going to, trim down state-owned enterprises, people are going to be losing jobs. And are those people trained enough to be able to take up new jobs under the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution and so on? And so it's about preparing people. Education is such a huge part of it. If you are going to rationalize, you need to ensure that the training is there so that workers at lower and middle levels are capable of taking up new jobs that are going to be created. But there's no doubt that big, sluggish, slow-moving bureaucracies in terms of government are a thing of the past, and many leaders across the continent have realized this and are starting to implement that.
And specifically pertaining to South Africa's SOEs, what would you advise government right now? What do they need to do?
There needs to be a balance found, of course, but there's no doubt that there is massive money being lost, billions of rands being lost to SOEs, and that something more pragmatic needs to come about. And so in South Africa, for example, the paper by Mboweni suggests that all the coal-fired power stations be sold off. Now, that probably is unlikely to happen in that, you have to balance the interests, and this is something that's probably going to be discussed at NEDLAC, where you have to balance the interests of business, labor, and government. But rationalization and selling off in that way is something that we feel takes a lot of the burden off of government, and you can bring in specialists that can then help you create jobs, run these businesses more efficiently, make sure that you don't have load shedding. And once you don't have load shedding, for example, I'm talking about Eskom obviously, that it allows the economy to be on a much more solid footing. We saw the Q2 results come out just the other day, where having not had load shedding as opposed to Q1, where we shrunk by 3.1, you can see the difference that it makes to have a stable grid and electricity coming through. So that is a big focus of ours, is to try and to ensure that certain basics like that are not compromised on, that you do have a solid supply of electricity, and that allows the fundamentals of our economy, things like mining and so on, to work, and that creates opportunities in other sectors.
And the importance of that, of course, is it speaks to some of the reasons that some South Africans have advanced as to why they have this negative sentiment towards foreign nationals, because they say people come here and they take our jobs. So just to contextualize that, whether that is the case or not is a discussion for another day.
I would probably say just very quickly that it's the patterns of migration, the extent to which people come from so-called failed states or whatever the case may be, does not necessarily justify a particular reaction, of which I think there is a certain sentiment amongst the South African population, which is a legacy, I think, of our apartheid past, which is hugely problematic and allows these things, such acts, to be easily triggered.
Absolutely. And then, Faith, just looking at how the South African government has actually dealt with this particular situation, what's your assessment of how the government has fared, and also how would you advise government to deal with this matter going forward?
I agree with Langa on the question about the reactive, almost knee-jerk responses of South Africa. But the government's response also, we have to look at it from the back of rhetoric that has been advanced in the past, particularly this idea of scapegoating and scaremongering and the othering of migrants. That has been the main reaction. But I think, so we have to look at it from a nuanced perspective. On one hand, you have South Africans who are hugely dissatisfied, hugely discontent about the government's response. On the other hand, you have government completely not almost assuming a tone-deaf response, not listening to the demands of the citizens, but at the same time trying to manage the reputational damage that has come across because of the violence that we've seen. So South Africa is in an increasingly difficult position in terms of its political capital on the continent, its diplomatic leverage, its reputation to a large extent. And for it to rectify that, I think, number one, government needs to acknowledge the problem, call it what it is, even if it's nuanced, even if it has multifaceted dimensions. Acknowledge that there's problems in this area and in that area, rather than just trying to push the problem under the carpet and move on. That's number one. Number two, I agree with Langa about the idea of informing the public on migration policy, on refugee policy, and grounding this information in facts and figures. I think that's also key, and moving away from what we've seen about inflammatory comments, inaccurate data, for instance. We need to move away from that, addressing the labor disparities, but I think also diplomatically to reach across the table, hear what the other African countries are up to, particularly with the idea about perception, because there are negative perceptions about South Africa, and this will have a negative impact on South Africa's foreign policy and developmental partnership agenda going forward, particularly because, as we know, in 2020, South Africa is going to chair the African Union. So those are some of the foreign policy considerations that South Africa has to take into account, and accept that there is a need, for instance, for pragmatic migration policy, building onto what has already been stated, the gaps identified, for instance, on the white paper on international migration.
Thank you so much to our guests. And with me here in the Joburg studio is Langa Malimela, IHS Markit Senior Country Risk Analyst, and Faith Mabera is a Senior Researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, who joined us from our Pretoria studios. With that, it's time for the news at 8 with Leanne.